Have you ever been frustrated by photos that just aren't sharp? I've been there too, and there's no worse feeling in photography than that. But in this video, I'm gonna be sharing a few tips on how to get the sharpest photos with any camera so that you never have to feel that disappointment again. The first tip has to do with light. You want to be shooting light in really high dynamic light situations. So this is very early in the morning or late in the evening where the light is still there, but it's at such a low angle that it's casting some really interesting light and shadows on the subjects that you're photographing. This is helpful because it brings out a lot more texture and detail within the subjects of your photos and not just low drab light on the scene. Dynamic light is really impactful even when it is a little bit hazy in the atmosphere because it casts some really nice side light on your subjects that gives a little bit more interest level to the photo and not just a photo of a tree. Now you're looking at a photo of a tree that has some nice light on one side of the trunk that has shadow and texture on the other side and makes those subjects look a little bit more three-dimensional. This is also really important when it comes to wildlife photography too, because that nice dynamic light really casts shadows on the features, feathers, fur of the animal and allows you to photograph a lot of texture and detail within your wildlife photos as well. Now, when the light is really dull and cloudy, it's great for waterfalls or water photography, but when it comes to other subjects in your photography, that makes the entire landscape and scene look very flat and one-dimensional. You want to bring out as much detail as possible, and those dynamic light situations are the way to go. Shutter speed is another factor when it comes to sharp photos that aren't blurry or out of focus. If you're shooting at the wrong shutter speed, you could be allowing movement in the photo, and even the slightest movement in a photo makes it look a little bit blurry and a little bit out of focus. For example, if you're photographing in a forest or next to a waterfall and you have any leaves or trees moving around in the scene, you want a shutter speed that's fast enough that freezes those objects in place and doesn't allow any movement to be recorded with the shutter speed that you're choosing. This is incredibly important when you're photographing and shooting something handheld instead of on a tripod, because when you're shooting handheld, you want to account for the movement and shake of your hand even when you press the shutter on your camera. So one of the things you can do is be sure that you're shooting at a shutter speed faster than 1/60th of a second, and you should be good to go shooting handheld. Anything longer of a shutter speed than 1/60th of a second will likely show some movement based on the shakiness of your hands that's just natural in your body. That's why I always recommend using a tripod when you can, but sometimes it's easier to go handheld. Just keep that shutter speed faster than 1/60th of a second. Aperture is the third thing to think about. You want to choose an aperture that matches the subject of your photography. So a grand landscape would be anything with an aperture of about f11 to f16 because it gives you that smallest point in the sweet spot of the lens that you're using to photograph as much focal distance as possible within the frame. Small scenes, you can use an aperture of anywhere from the widest point of your aperture on your lens to about f8 to give you the most detail possible in there, and wildlife is about the same, the widest aperture to about f8. Now here's the one important thing to remember when you're dealing with aperture and sharpness. Every single lens is a little bit different. They all have different widest apertures on them. So if you're using a lens like with the widest aperture that's f5.6, you may want to stop up to about f8 depending on the subject that you're photographing, because if you look at the focal chart of your lens, you can see that at the widest aperture point, you do get some softness on the edges of your photo. This is especially prominent when you're using ultra wide angle lenses that have a lot of distortion in them. You can get some blurry and fuzziness right on the edges of that lens. In just a second, I'm going to show you a few more tips on how you can get sharper photos with any camera. Plus, I'm going to show you a tip on how you can make sharper photos look super sharp. But first, I want to tell you about Landscape Photography University Plus. So we're talking a lot about the fundamentals of photography in this video. If you go to Landscape Photography University right now and select our courses, you can buy any course that we have standalone. Or you could get LPU Plus and get all of our courses for under $11. LPU Plus is going to guarantee you one new course included every single month, so that you can be sure you're staying on top of your photo game and taking the best photos of your life. I'll put that link to LPU Plus down in the video description, or you could go to landscapephotographyuniversity.com right now. Focus is the obvious culprit for fuzzy photos. You obviously need sharp focus for sharp photos. Now, when it comes to landscape photography, I would highly recommend using manual focus. You can use spot focusing, but I've had issues where the camera actually jumps around the focus point before I click the shutter, only to find on my computer later that the focal point was different than the one that I wanted to actually shoot, and it ruined the photo. So I like to use manual focus, zooming in on my subject and really being sure that is intact sharp focus. Now, the easiest thing to do here is use an aperture of f14 to f16 and focus halfway between the lower thirds part of the photo and the bottom of the frame. This is going to ensure that you get everything into the distance of your photo in acceptable focus, plus everything really close to the foreground. This is called hyperfocal distance, and it actually helps a ton when you're using wide-angle lenses, getting really close to your foregrounds in the scene. This technique works in 95% of the photos that you'll take, but there are some situations where you may need to focus stack, which is a little bit different of a technique that you use in landscape photography, where you take two photos at different focal distance and then blend those together in post-processing later, but usually hyperfocal distance is going to do the trick for you. You can also improve the sharpness of your photos in post-processing, like with softwares of Photoshop and Luminar and Topaz AI. I like to use Luminar for that, so let me show you how that works. So on my screen, you see this photo of a waterfall and a mountain in the background from Iceland. Now, this photo is already very sharp. There are a lot of details in this, but you can actually make it even sharper. And this really solves a lot of the problems, even if you have the faintest bit of fuzziness on the edges of your photos, maybe even down in the corners of the bottom of your frame. All you do is go to Super Sharp AI, and the adjustments I just set to about universal, and then maybe do a low super sharp effect on this. And once it starts rendering, it's going to put a lot more detail into the photo and make it that much sharper. So it didn't do a ton here, but it actually made the edges of this mountain and a lot of the textures and detail in here a little bit sharper too. Let me show you how to do this in Lightroom just in case you aren't using Luminar. If you aren't and you want to check it out more, I have that linked in the video description for you, but let's head over to Lightroom. Let's work on this photo in Lightroom. If you come down to your detail window, you see sharpening down here. Now, it's easy to just click sliders and drag them around, but there are some hidden tricks that you can use with sharpening in Lightroom that are going to make your sharpening that much better. So if you come into sharpening, you can definitely scroll up on the amount of sharpening, but you want to be sure that the main subject of your sharpening is what you have selected. So I'm just going to select this edge of the flower to be sure I have a high contrast point that I'm looking at and editing here. So you see radius, detail, and masking. A lot of people don't even know what these are, but here's how you use them. If you hold down your Alt or Option key on a Mac and click and drag this feature up, you can see, especially in the detail window, how sharp those edges become when you're using the radius. It's going to be more detailed when you bring it all the way up, but I've found just getting a little bit of hint of that detail on the edge is great. Next, for the detail slider, here's what you want to do. Use the same key, Alt or Option on your Mac, and you just scroll that up to really make that detail of the radius that you selected, and you can do the same thing with masking here. Now, masking is a little bit different. Anything in the masking that is white is going to be the main part that's edited. Anything that's black is not going to be included in that edit. So as I hold down my Alt or Option key and scroll this up, you can see that the less I include masking, the more that's going to be added to the entire photo, but the more I bring it all the way up, the more it's going to be added to just the edges of the main focal distance that I was choosing. So I'm going to have it somewhere around there because I want to maintain the blurriness in the background. So that's how you use sharpening in Lightroom. Remember, this is great for those already sharp photos that you want to make that much sharper and bring out a lot of those fine details in. Image noise can also make a photo less sharp. This noise is caused by having the wrong shutter speed and aperture selected so that you have to raise your ISO too high to balance the light. If you want a full video on how to use ISO the right way and avoid this problem, click or tap this video showing up on your screen right now.